All right, welcome back for another deep dive. You know the drill. We take some really interesting source material. And today we have a topic that's, well, especially relevant for someone with a philosophical background like yourself. Neoplatonism. We're taking our cues from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this one.
This is a school of thought that really was a major player back in the late Greco-Roman world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking 3rd to the 7th century AD. It's fascinating, though, because they weren't just trying to bring back Plato. These thinkers were really into synthesizing like centuries worth of Hellenic thought into a whole system.
It's more than a historical footnote, though. You know, this is a big deal. This really did change how people looked at reality for centuries. You know, one of the things that got me was how ambitious these thinkers were, just pulling all these different ideas together.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to unpack this whole Neoplatonism thing, get down to the nitty-gritty of its core ideas, and see what insights might still be relevant, maybe even challenge a philosophical mind like yours. So where do we even start with something this massive?
Well, a good place to start is always the historical context, right? You know, like who are the major players and what were the intellectual influences that shaped their thinking? Now, generally, people think of Plotinus, who lived from 2045 to 270 AD, as the founder of Neoplatonism, but his own teacher, Ammoniusakis, is kind of an enigma. I mean, we don't have any of his writings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Plotinus sets up his school in Rome around 245 AD, and it's his student, Porphyry, who's really key in gathering and publishing Plotinus's teachings. This is what we know as the Enneads.
Oh, so Porphyry's the reason these ideas survives, basically, the Enneads. 6 books, 9 essays each. That's a lot of thought right there.
Yeah.
And putting Plotinus up there with Plato and Aristotle, bold move.
It is. But honestly, Plotinus's work really does represent a powerful blend of earlier Greek philosophy. He's drawing heavily on Plato's dialogues, for sure. But Aristotle's metaphysics is also super important to him. Then you've got the Stoic ethics in there, the ideas of Alexander of Aphrodisias. And we can't forget the Middle Platonists, especially Numenius of Apamea. And get this, there's even debate about possible Gnostic and Hermetic influences. Even though, you know, Plotinus himself was critical of some Gnostic ideas, it's important to remember they were very much aware of early Christianity too. So in a way, the Neoplatonists were like trying to harmonize like almost the entire Hellenic tradition. I mean, except for the Epicureans.
Oh, yeah.
And the really hardcore materialist Stoics.
So they're like on this big intellectual reconciliation project.
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't just some ivory tower thing, right? I mean, the source material says Neoplatonism had a wide appeal.
Oh, absolutely. Neoplatonism was super adaptable, appealed to a lot of different people, from those super into intellectual stuff to people more on a spiritual path. And, you know, what's really interesting from a philosophical perspective is how much influence it had on early Christian thinkers. These guys were looking for a philosophical way to explain their theology.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, right. So you've got figures like Origen, who some people believe even studied under Ammoniusakis. Then you have the Cappadocian fathers like Basil the Great and Gregory of Nazianzus. And then you've got Augustine, all deeply shaped by Neoplatonic ideas. Even the very words they use, the frameworks for those early theological debates about the Trinity, the nature of Christ, all of that was coming from this Greek philosophy stew they were cooking up.
It really shows you how philosophy gets into everything, even something like theology, which you might think is totally separate.
Yeah.
And Neoplatonism, it doesn't end with ancient times, right?
Nope, not at all. Even after the Platonic Academy in Athens closed down, people were still teaching this stuff in other intellectual hubs. And then, boom, the Renaissance. Neoplatonism is back in a big way. Huge impact on philosophy, art, literature. Like, it was never really gone.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop now. We've got the big names, this whole intellectual world they're part of. But let's get into the system itself now. What were the core ideas, the building blocks of Neoplatonism?
Well, like a lot of ancient philosophies, it's all about mind over matter. Mindful consciousness, or now, is more fundamental than the physical world. Now, Plato and Aristotle had their little disagreements about the nature of universals. But for the Neoplatonists, those differences weren't the big issue.
Okay.
What mattered was that reality at its heart is more about ideas than stuff. So basically, the mind isn't just some random thing that appears, it's the foundation of everything else.
So it's not a byproduct, it's the source. That's a big departure from a lot of the materialist stuff you see today.
For sure. Now, the other big idea they had was principlemalism. It's the belief that there's one ultimate source of all reality.
Okay.
They saw this first principle as divine, often calling it the first, the one, or even the good. And their logic here is quite interesting, philosophically speaking. They argued that a cause has to be, in a way, more real than its effect.
Okay.
And because they already believed that consciousness is fundamental, it made sense to them that this ultimate cause had to be a conscious principle.
So if everything comes from this one principle of consciousness, a big question pops up.
Right.
How do you get from this perfect oneness to all this diversity we see? It reminds me of what cosmologists are trying to do today,
Right.
explaining how the universe came from a singularity. It's the same problem, just framed differently.
Exactly. That was the central philosophical puzzle for the Neoplatonists. How do you explain this incredibly diverse cosmos with all its crazy phenomena if it all started with this super simple principle of consciousness? They came up with some pretty innovative and complex answers, though, much more sophisticated than earlier attempts.
And they weren't saying it was created at a specific moment in time, right? That's important?
Nope, not at all. They didn't see the universe as something created in a temporal sense. It's more like an eternal, ongoing process of emerging from this first principle, not some one-time event in the distant past. That's actually where they bumped heads with some of the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thinkers later on. The whole idea of creation ex nihilo at a specific point in time.
So how do they explain the one giving rise to everything else? People use the word emanation, but that seems kind of misleading, right?
Yeah, emanation can be a bit tricky. They actually preferred to talk about procession and return, perhodos and epistrophe in Greek.
Okay.
Emanation makes it sound like something's flowing out and making the source smaller, which isn't what they meant at all. They did use the analogy of light from the sun, but even they knew it wasn't perfect.
Sure.
Because there's no actual stuff being created between the one and what comes from it.
Procession and return, huh? So like flowing out, but also having this pull back to the source.
Exactly. They notice that every action seems to have two sides, an inner and an outer.
Okay.
Like the sun's internal activity, all that nuclear fusion stuff leads to heat and light. A tree's inner nature, its logos, leads to it producing fruit. Even our thoughts and feelings, they lead to actions and words. The big point is, the outer effect isn't the reason for the inner activity. It's more like a natural side effect. And these outer activities can become inner activities for something else down the line.
Oh, I see. So it's this chain of like things coming from other things, but not in that simple cause and effect way we usually think about it.
You got it. And another key idea for them is that nothing on the lower levels of being is truly new. It's all prefigured in a more perfect way on the higher levels. Like, you can't have a property just pop up out of nowhere. It has to have a root in its cause. And when you apply that to the one itself, well, they described it as absolutely simple, beyond even being just pure unity. You can't really say what it is directly, but you can look at its effects, which is the entire universe. And that suggests some kind of boundless energy at its core.
So the one is this ultimate source, and its nature is to just, I don't know, overflow outwards.
In a way, yeah. And the first thing in this outward flow is what they called nous, which we can translate as absolute consciousness. This is a really important part of their system.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Right. And remember their mind over matter thing. They believed that the first thing to come from the one's perfection had to be nous, pure consciousness. They were going against those materialist ideas that say consciousness just kind of appears out of nowhere. They said, no way, consciousness has to be the first and most real effect of the one, the highest level of reality besides the one itself. They called consciousness the second hypostasis.
Hypostasis. That's a loaded term, especially with how it shows up in Christian thought later. What did it really mean for them?
So hypostasis comes from a Greek verb meaning to stand under or to be a foundation. For the Neoplatonists, it meant a distinct being or level of reality that comes from and depends on the first principle. So consciousness stands under the one. Now, the one itself can be called the first hypostasis, but when you're talking about the other hypostases like consciousness and soul, it's clear that they come from and are a bit different from the absolute oneness of the one.
Okay, so consciousness is the first step away from that perfect unity of the one. What does this absolute consciousness do, though? What's its activity?
Its main activity is to understand. And to understand, you have to know causes, right? So consciousness, trying to understand itself, looks back at its origin, the one, and sees it as the source of its being. This turning back, this self-reflection is crucial. It's where the original unity of consciousness starts to break down and create duality. This is where things like identity and difference, bigger and smaller, number, change, and stillness all appear within consciousness. Think of it like a pond reflecting the sun. The reflection creates an image, a duality between the real sun and its reflection.
So by knowing, by understanding, it creates distinctions where there was only unity before. That's pretty profound.
It is. And this act of self-understanding by consciousness, that's also where the Platonic forms come from, the world of perfect ideas.
Okay.
So the Neoplatonists are saying the entire world of forms just comes naturally from consciousness understanding itself. It's not like there's some divine craftsman shaping things according to a plan.
Right.
This is a big difference from Plato's Timaeus or the Genesis creation story. No outside force, no blueprint. The ideal world just unfolds from consciousness reflecting on the one.
That's a really elegant idea.
Yeah.
But hard to wrap your head around, for sure. And from consciousness, we get another hypothesis, soul.
Right. Soul, or psyche in Greek, comes next in this procession. It arises effortlessly from consciousness doing its thing. And the Neoplatonists saw soul as the link, the bridge between the world of forms and the material world. In fact, they saw Neoplatonism as primarily a philosophy of the soul, or psychology in the original sense of the word.
Yeah.
So it's all about the nature and activities of soul as this life-giving principle.
It's interesting, the text mentions this contrast between the second law of thermodynamics and all the diversity in the biosphere. And it suggests that Neoplatonism might have something to say about how that works through the gradual appearance of forms in the world. That's a really cool perspective.
It is. It's different from a purely Darwinian view of evolution, where it's all random mutation and natural selection. But it offers a sort of complementary perspective. They're saying that the eternal forms of everything exist within consciousness, and they gradually show up in the physical world, limited by space and time. But their forms weren't just static blueprints. They were dynamic, conscious things full of life, interacting within a living world of ideas. And it's their activity expressed through soul that ultimately makes them appear imperfectly in the physical universe.
So the world we see is like a shadowy reflection of this vibrant world of forms.
Yeah, that's a common way to put it. But how those forms actually get into the material world is a big question. The Neoplatonists were dealing with the mind-body problem just like we are today. Their solution focused on soul being the active link between the two.
And this idea of the universe being a living thing with a world soul, that plays a role here too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of ancient thinkers, like Plato and the Timaeus, had this idea of a cosmos that's alive with a soul. But the Neoplatonists took it in a different direction. They didn't think there was some god out there crafting a world soul. For them, soul, as the outer expression of consciousness, naturally looks back at its source, the world of forms, to understand itself. And in doing that, it becomes informed by those forms and carries them into the material world, giving birth to the universe as we know it. So the whole physical world exists within soul.
So soul is this weird thing. It's a separate hypostasis, but it's also the process of the ideal world expressing itself in living things.
Yeah, it's tricky. Figuring out exactly what soul is something people are still debating. And they also made a distinction between this cosmic soul and what they called nature, physis.
Right.
They saw nature as a lower aspect of consciousness, the part that's responsible for the basic functions of the universe, kind of silently contemplating and bringing the most basic aspects of the world of forms into physical reality. And this shows you that they believe that even matter, even the most insignificant stuff, has a divine aspect, a connection to the eternal. So for them, the material world was fundamentally good and beautiful, not flawed or evil.
Which is pretty different from those philosophies that say matter is the source of all evil.
Right. So how did they understand matter if it wasn't evil?
Yeah, how did they explain that?
Well, they often use this analogy of darkness being the absence of light. Matter, they said, is kind of like a byproduct, the furthest point from the one's emanation, where that outward flow of energy just runs out of steam. It's passive, doesn't have any inherent activity or power to shape itself. It's the end of the line, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it's also super important because it's the stage where soul, informed by consciousness, can become visible to us.
So matter isn't nothing, but it's not some independent force either. It's more like an absence, a limit.
Yeah, exactly. It exists, but not as something that does things on its own. It's just a necessary part of soul's existence, formless and immaterial in itself. And this idea actually caused some debate later on within Neoplatonism. Some people thought that matter might at least have some basic three-dimensionality as a prerequisite for taking on form.
Okay, that makes sense. And given all this, how do they see evil if matter wasn't inherently bad?
Well, Plotinus said that evil doesn't come from the higher levels, from the one or consciousness. It comes from below, associated with matter. But again, matter itself isn't evil.
Okay.
It's not like some independent evil force, like in some Gnostic systems. Instead, evil happens when beings, especially humans, get distracted by the material world. They focus on the temporary stuff instead of the true being and goodness of the forms. It's this downward focus, this attachment to the fleeting, that corrupts the soul and causes what we call evil. But this explanation wasn't universally accepted. Proclus, for example, disagreed. He thought that souls could be actively morally bad, not just passively influenced by matter.
Wow, so there was debate even within Neoplatonism itself. It's more complex than it seems at first glance. Speaking of complexity, how did all this metaphysics play out in their ethics? How were people supposed to live their lives based on all this?
Well, they saw humans as microcosms, mini versions of the whole universe. They're a mix of everything: unity, intellect, consciousness, soul, nature, and even matter through the body.
Okay.
But they were adamant that our true identity isn't just our physical or social existence. We're divine beings, souls that have somehow ended up in this material world. Plotinus put it really beautifully. The goal of life is to bring back the God in us to the divine in the all.
That's a great quote.
Right. Now, they did believe in the classic virtues like justice, prudence, courage, and temperance. But for them, those virtues were mainly about purification. They were tools to help the soul ascend and reunite with divine consciousness and, ultimately, the One.
So it wasn't just about being a good person in a worldly sense. It was about this spiritual journey back to the divine.
Exactly. Their ethics were all about the individual's inner life. The ultimate goal was eudaimonia, which for them meant becoming like a god, returning to the source. And the way to achieve this salvation was through philosophy. It was all about rigorous intellectual and spiritual discipline, turning away from the distractions of the body and contemplating the divine. And this focus on self-effort put them at odds with the Christian idea of being saved through grace.
It's a really comprehensive and interconnected worldview, that's for sure. And as our source makes clear, its influence on Western thought is undeniable, even if it's not always obvious today.
Oh, the influence is huge. It's like the thread that runs through so much of our intellectual and spiritual history. Through people like Augustine, the Cappadocian Fathers, and that mysterious figure, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, Neoplatonism became a core part of early Christian theology. It also played a huge role in how Greek philosophy got into the Islamic world and then back to the West. Through books like The Theology of Aristotle and the work of thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and later Maimonides.
It really went everywhere. And the Renaissance seems like a key moment for bringing it back into the spotlight in Europe.
Definitely. People like Gemistus Plethon, Cardinal Bessarion, and especially Marsilio Ficino were translating and interpreting Plato and, importantly, Plotinus. And that ignited a whole new wave of interest in Neoplatonism. It affected everything: philosophy, art, literature. It shaped how people thought about beauty and had these deep discussions. Some scholars even argue that Neoplatonism had a more direct influence on later idealist thinkers, like the Cambridge Platonists, Leibniz, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, Bergson, even Teilhard de Chardin, than Plato and Aristotle themselves.
That's amazing. But even with all that, Neoplatonism doesn't get as much attention these days. People see it as too speculative, too abstract.
Yeah, I think you're right. The way we think now, all about empiricism and materialism, plus all the scientific discoveries we've made, make it harder to connect with Neoplatonic ideas. Plus, in the big religions, the idea of God is more personal, like a human-like figure. So the Neoplatonic idea of the One, this distant, impersonal source, might feel less relatable.
But as the text says, we should remember how much effort those last pagan thinkers put into explaining the world based on a non-material unified principle. It was a truly monumental task.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we've explored the historical context of Neoplatonism, the key ideas of mind over matter and principle monoism, the concepts of the One and procession and return, the emergence of consciousness and the forms, the role of soul, how they understood matter and evil, their ethics focused on deification, and the lasting impact they've had on Western thought.
It's amazing how Neoplatonism created this complete system for understanding reality, all based on a single principle of consciousness. And that idea, even after all these centuries, still sparks debate and makes us think. So to you, dear listener, how might Neoplatonism's view of this immaterial, unified source challenge or inform our current conversations about consciousness, the nature of reality, the relationship between the physical and non-physical? It's a legacy worth pondering.
Absolutely. If you want to learn more, we really encourage you to check out that entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or dive into the original works of Plotinus and the other Neoplatonists. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And with that, until next time, happy deep diving.